Okay, I'll make that the last question. So next we're going to have Adrian talking about Plato and education. Okay.
Okay. Now, I'm actually going to be talking about the importance of education in Plato's philosophy generally. However, my aim here is to convince you that Plato is worth reading, and in part as well, to take some of his earlier work and show how relevant it actually is to the way in which we currently conceive of education. And I don't have a PowerPoint, right? So you'll have to either listen to me or go to sleep. Anyway, so what I'll do is I'll begin and I'll give this lecture, and then I'll do the Q&A afterwards, because I've left some things open, partly deliberately and partly just for reasons of time. So Plato's concern with education saturates much of his work, most notably in Republic, in which it was required that future rulers or guardians, you may have come across this in Republic, follow a rigorous and highly specific curriculum tailored to their specific characters. Indeed, much of Book 3 of Republic is dedicated to the kind of relationship there needs to be between one's character and the kind of education one receives. Guardians must have certain natural qualities, among them physical strength, a courageous character, and the disposition of a philosopher. Plato defines this latter characteristic as being, quote, gifted with a real love of knowledge, unquote, and that's from 376b of the Republic, and that's the Stephanus pagination, so whichever edition you may own, you'll find that these references hold for each of them. Nonetheless, these natural qualities also require an education which nurtures potential guardians in ways appropriate for ruling. Such an education, according to Plato, requires a precisely tailored curriculum, one that begins with developing the mind and character, so that's sort of reading, writing, and so on, and is followed by physical education. There is also literary and musical education for guardians in the Republic as Plato conceives it. However, this dimension of their education is subject to strict censorship for fear of the corrupting influence certain forms of literature and music may have on the young minds of potential rulers. Much of Homer, for example, is rejected as dangerous for reasons pertaining to his alleged misrepresentation of the gods, as is poetry of most kinds. Plato is also suspicious of the influence that certain phrases in literary and poetic works may have. And this is a wonderful quote I'm just going to read now. We must get rid, too, of all those horrifying and frightening names in the underworld, the rivers of wailing and gloom, and the ghosts and corpses, and all other things of this kind, whose very names are enough to make everyone who hears them shudder. They may do well enough for other purposes, but we are afraid that the thrill of terror they cause will make our guardians more nervous and less tough than they should be. Okay, now it is also important to point out that Plato is not disparaging of the work of Homer and others. He's just merely concerned about the effect that their stories will have on the minds of these rulers, or these potential rulers. Of music, Plato is similarly censorious, allowing only 2 modes. Now, I'm not an expert in Greek modes, but if you look at 399a to c of Republic, you will find some detail there that Plato gives. And in terms of physical education, he excludes, among other things, Syracusan and Sicilian cooking and Corinthian girlfriends. Right? Anyway, I won't say too much more about Plato's conception of education in the Republic, or directly at least. Suffice to say that in addition to what I've just mentioned, guardians cannot be polymaths, either because, quote, a man cannot play many parts as well as he can one, unquote. They can't be polymaths because of this. Your direction of thought is torn in too many directions, as it were. So he says, knowledge of the essential nature of things, or the Platonic Forms, you might have come across that expression, can only be gained without having one's attention drawn in too many directions. In other words, true knowledge of reality and justice, which is the aim of any guardian, cannot be acquired if one becomes what Plato calls a sight lover, someone who, for example, quote again, loves looking and listening and is delighted by beautiful sounds and colours and shapes and the works of art which makes use of them, but whose mind is incapable of seeing or delighting in the essential nature of beauty itself. And that's from the Republic 476b. It is such censorship of works of literature, music, and art more generally for which Plato has become notorious, in addition to his much appraised theory of forms. And in terms of his philosophy of education, it is these dimensions which have garnered the most attention. However, and this is important, you should bear in mind that Republic is about the hypothetical development and realization of a just state, and that accordingly, discussions of educational matters are largely concerned with its instrumental merits in realizing such a state. Less well discussed, at least in explicit terms, is the central importance of Plato's non-instrumental conception of education to his philosophy, and it is this which I'm basically going to be considering this afternoon. Firstly, it's important to retain awareness that it is this less often discussed conception of education which to a large extent informs Plato's thoughts about guardian training or guardian education in Republic. The common threads are a love of knowledge and truth and suspicion of oratory. Added to this is Socrates' stance that the unexamined life is not worth living, better translated, I believe, as the unexamined life is unworthy of a human being, which is first made explicit in the early dialogue, The Apology, and I'll explain why I believe that in a little later. However, my main aim here is to show that far from being the preserve of old white males, the study of Plato's philosophy of education is of central importance to anyone with an interest in educational policy and education more generally. For instance, parents, teachers, and the senior management structures of our schools and universities. Indeed, I will argue that his work is more important than ever in a Western culture increasingly disposed to see education as a commodity whose value can only be determined by what can be done with it in terms of the achievement of social prestige, employment, and economic welfare, rather than what it can make of a life in terms of nurturing an unconditional love of the world. To this end, I will draw in particular on two dialogues from Plato's earlier period, Gorgias, which is my favourite, it's a wonderful dialogue, go out and buy it. Penguin translation is great. And The Apology, and use them to discuss and shed light on distinctions that are internal to our understanding of the nature of education. These include the related distinctions between education and training, and authentic and inauthentic forms of academic study. Plato's work also serves to show that genuine education is about much more than gaining employment or a better paid job. It also has further and perhaps more controversial implications for how we should conceive the variety of subjects now available to study at school and university. The importance of any kind of dialogue, Plato famously writes mainly in dialogue, the importance of any kind of dialogue is that it is mainly through speaking and writing to one another that the possibility of understanding others and their actions exists at all. Indeed, it is largely through such means that we come to understand authentic and counterfeit forms of human behaviour. This was not lost on Plato, who used it to demonstrate the difference between authentic conversation and mere rhetoric or oratory. And he didn't do this always effectively, it has to be said, but he was setting out to do so. In this respect, Plato's main target were the sophists and the practice of sophistry more generally. Sophists, broadly speaking those who practiced the art of speech-making, were primarily concerned with persuading their audience of the case they were making in relation to any given subject. One might equate them with modern political spin doctors. The sophist Gorgias, for instance, claimed in Plato's dialogue of the same name that the skill of sophistry gave him the power to answer any question that was put to him. Plato's quarrel with sophistry can be read as twofold. Firstly, sophists implicitly demean their audiences or their interlocutors because they treat them as objects to be persuaded, as means to their own ends, as opposed to people to whom truthfulness might matter. Indeed, the demeaning of one's audience or interlocutor in this way is heavily interwoven with the ways in which we come to believe something. The sophists, or spin doctors, do not acknowledge their audience's desire to have their questions answered truthfully, but rather treat them as comprising as objects to be persuaded. And if you look at the debates that surrounded Brexit and the Remain campaigns, both were horrendously guilty of this. Okay. Thus, secondly, the demeaning of one's audience is tied not only to whether what they come to believe is true or false, but also to what it means to come to believe something for the right reasons. And this is why there is anger when politicians and their spin doctors employ such disingenuous arguments. Of course, what a sophist or spin doctor may convince you of may be true. But as I say, the difficulty lies in how it is you have come to believe what you believe. Plato's attack on the sophists was frequently centered on their habitual lack of providing adequate definitions. The vast majority of the early Socratic dialogues was saturated with examples of sophists making claims concerning various concepts of which they were speaking, courage, virtue, knowledge, that sort of thing. And although it's contentious whether or not Socrates was right in always demanding essentialist definitions of concepts, that's definitions that comprise a set of necessary and sufficient conditions, his approach was one of seeking truth together as a form of conversation. In other words, he tried, along with his interlocutor or audience, to rise to the task before him in ways that were not compromised merely by the desire to persuade, but rather by the desire to be truthful. This meant believing in one's own position, but being willing to have one's mind opened and changed by one's interlocutor in ways that one had never before thought of. In this sense, Socrates' commitment to truth was an ethical one, and, as we shall see, one that has profound implications for education. The matter of education is never far from the headlines, frequently taking centre stage. In a now famous speech, Tony Blair placed an economically based conception of it at the centre of his 1997 election campaign. More recently, since the onset of the economic crisis, educational institutions have come under the spotlight in terms of what they are able to contribute to the economic welfare of the nation. This has resulted in universities being instructed to optimize their research and teaching in areas that are most likely to have immediate social and economic impact. And the phrase having immediate social and economic impact is actually a direct quote from an email I received when I was teaching at Heathrop College, which is from hefty higher education funding people, and so you begin to despair when you read stuff like that. Schools are being asked to teach in ways which nurture the idea that the point or purpose of education is to secure a place at university with an eye to attaining better paid employment when one graduates. This is exemplified both implicitly and explicitly in the form of the emphasis on STEM subjects and introductory descriptions in exam syllabi or syllabuses, which encourage a potential candidate to take a particular subject on grounds of its extrinsic benefit. Transferable skills, you too will be able to earn loads of money in this bank if you take philosophy. Individuals are asked to buy into this argument on grounds of increased personal wealth. The overarching idea, of course, is that overall improved economic performance will serve to improve the individual living standards of its citizens. There is nothing wrong with that per se. Indeed, it's an admirable goal. But when it is done at the expense of aspects of our lives that nourish meaning and understanding of the human condition, it becomes damaging in ways that run far deeper than seem immediately obvious. Within this cultural climate, many parents discourage their offspring from considering arts-based subjects at university because they perceive them to be disadvantageous to their offspring's jobs prospects, and even some teachers, appallingly in my view, suggest that pursuing arts and humanities subjects at undergraduate level is a soft option. Those who still elect to study disciplines such as philosophy, literature, fine art, or music, and so on, often face questions such as, "What are you going to do with that?" or condescending comments implying that they cannot expect a free ride and need to be prepared to give something back to society. Although this overall view of education is considered by its advocates to be progressive, a step in the right direction, away from an anachronistic ivory towers conception of education that is no longer relevant to the modern age, Plato anticipated it, over 2,300 years ago, in his dialogue Gorgias. In perhaps the greatest challenge to Socrates' ethical commitment to truth and philosophy, the orator Callicles makes the following speech. Quote, "Philosophy, Socrates, is a pretty toy, if one indulges in it with moderation at the right time of life. But if one pursues it further than one should, it is absolute ruin. However gifted a man may be, he will inevitably lack all the accomplishments which one must possess if one is to be thought a gentleman and a person of consideration. It is a fine thing to have a tincture of philosophy, just so much as makes an educated person. But there is no disgrace in a lad philosophizing. But when a man of mature years remains devoted to this study, the thing becomes absurd. I like philosophy in a young lad. It is thoroughly suitable and a mark of a liberal nature. A lad who neglects philosophy I regard as mean-spirited and never likely to entertain any fine or noble ambition. But when I see an older man still at philosophy and refusing to abandon it, that man seems to me, Socrates, to need a whipping. As I said just now, such a person, however great his natural gifts, will never be a real man, shunning the busy life of the heart of the city and the meetings in which, as the poet says, men win renown. He will spend the rest of his life in obscurity, whispering with 3 or 4 lads in a corner and never uttering any sentiment which is large or liberal or adequate to the occasion." Unquote. It's a good speech, though, isn't it? He was a good sophist, was Callicles, and he was not maybe as good as Gorgias, but he was one of Gorgias' chums. So, yeah. Like many contemporary politicians, educational managers, and some teachers and parents, Callicles believed that what is practical determines what matters. To him, achievement in life was answerable to the attainment of wealth, social prestige, and the admiration of one's peers. Accordingly, on his conception of it, education should be answerable to how far it allows one to progress in such directions. While many profess that Callicles is an obvious Philistine, I think, alas, far fewer than make such professions actually believe what they say in their hearts. Whatever is to be said in favour or against that last remark, it should be clear that the ethical commitments of Callicles are fundamentally different to those of Socrates. What matters to them is different in each case. From this observation, it becomes quite obvious that it is what matters which determines what is practical, as opposed to the other way round, i.e. what's practical determining what matters. And, I've heard it tons of times. We'll say, why were you doing this subject? It's just not practical. Right? Well, that presupposes what matters to you. Right? So, some commentators... I should say, for Callicles, what mattered not only determined what was practical, but also shaped his conception of education. And the same can be said of Socrates. Some commentators on Socrates have intimated that his position was one based on rational justification, whilst those of the orators were based on, say, wealth or social prestige. Other commentators, such as the wonderful Gregory Vlastos, have observed of Socrates, quote, that the man who had this faith in a commitment to truthfulness to a supreme degree should have mistaken it for knowledge is yet another part of the paradox of Socrates. And I don't want to make further direct comment about whether or not Socrates' commitment to truth and the way it is exemplified in his conduct also shows an attempt by him to rationally justify it. But there are 2 great books worth reading if you're interested in this. The first is called Plato's Moral Theory by a chap called Terry Irwin, and that's Clarendon Press, Oxford. I think it's 1977 it was published. And the other, which is a wonderful book of essays, is called The Philosophy of Socrates, a collection of critical essays edited by Vlastos, Gregory Vlastos, and that's Palgrave Macmillan. So rather than commenting further on that, I want to turn to the implications that the respective ethical commitments of Callicles and Socrates have for our understanding of education. I remarked just now that what matters determines what is practical, rather than it being the other way round. For Callicles, an honoured position within society was his ultimate end, and he justified this in ways which appealed to the power that oratory gave him in this respect. By contrast, Socrates expressed the thought that human life provides the possibility of infinitely deepening one's understanding, knowledge, and love of the world, something that is implicitly demeaned by Callicles in his challenge to Socrates. Accordingly, the role of education in the respective lives of Callicles and Socrates is very different. For Callicles, education provides an instrumental role that is vital for the realization of his ambition to achieve social standing, an ambition he believes it is noble for all to have, and one, therefore, that requires a person's education to be shaped in ways appropriate to this aim. For Socrates, however, an education is interdependent with the search for truth, a search that is consistent with studying a discipline in ways that are answerable to the standards set by the nature of the discipline and not those that might relate to its extrinsic benefits, whether that discipline be philosophy, physics, poetry, mathematics, music, history, chemistry, archaeology, and so on. In one of the final speeches at his trial, Socrates says, quote, "If I tell you that to let no day pass without discussing goodness and all the other subjects about which you hear me talking and examining both myself and others is really the best thing that a man can do, and that life without this sort of examination is not worth living, you will be even less inclined to believe me. Nevertheless, that is how it is, gentlemen, as I maintain, though it is not easy to convince you of it." Socrates' point is not that the unexamined life is not worth living because there are better things to do. Were that his point, then he would in essence be in agreement with Callicles. For Callicles would also have said the unexamined life was not worth living because a liberal education, one that includes the study and examination of arts and humanities subjects as well as mathematics and the sciences, is required in order to rise to eminence within society. Rather, Socrates observes that human beings have the capacity to infinitely deepen their understanding and love of the world, and as such believes that to ignore this capacity is both unworthy and demeaning of one's humanity. And this is why I said that the Socratic slogan, "the unexamined life is not worth living," is better expressed as "the unexamined life is unworthy of a human being." Accordingly, with the respective viewpoints of Callicles and Socrates in mind, we can now see the first of the distinctions I alluded to at the beginning of this lecture, namely that between education and training. The study of an academic discipline for no other reason than one's love of it is expressed by an absorption in it and trying to rise to the highest standards set by the greatest figures in it. By contrast, training sets limits around what is studied because it is accountable to particular ends, social and economic, for example. A career or economic-based conception of education is really just a species of training, because what is practical is answerable to something other than the discipline being studied. It is, as such, a means to certain ends, and once those ends have been achieved, one can, without further thought, relinquish one's studies. Put it another way, education is about the development of individual independence of mind and the possibility of perpetually deepening one's understanding. Training is not. But should we accept the Socratic thought that an unexamined life is unworthy of a human being? If we do not accept it, then the possibility of the perpetuation of independence of mind is compromised insofar as how we are educated, in inverted commas, will be limited to what has been understood to yield most economic benefit. In other words, if we reject Socrates, then the essence of any distinction between education and training collapses. And I think this is kind of what's happening with the way education policy is being developed. In spite of this distinction, I must just check that I'm not going to overrun here as well. No, I'm doing okay so far. In spite of this distinction, it is unlikely that Socratic thoughts of the kind expressed above will cut much ice with those arguing for an economically driven conception of education. Doubtless, they will respond in ways akin to Callicles. We don't care about education in terms of deepened understanding and the love of the world. We care about the mighty dollar. Express your conception of education in dollars, and then we will care. Otherwise, it's just navel-gazing. We need to get on with the proper business of the day. I've heard that a few times too. Indeed, such a spirit is fairly culturally entrenched in the UK. We see it in the policy decisions of our politicians, the advice of Ofsted, the ways in which university departments have to justify the existence of their disciplines, commentary in the media, the kinds of study many parents encourage in their offspring, and even, perish the thought, the conduct of some students. Generally speaking, and for complex reasons, the disciplines that comprise humanities education have been particular victims of the idea that how we are educated should be answerable to social and economic ends. Much less is heard in relation to the economic and social value of esoteric scientific developments, even when they cost a good deal of money, such as projects associated with the Large Hadron Collider. Perhaps this is because of the prestige that, by luck, such endeavours bring with them, prestige of the kind that Socrates could never hope or want to attain. That said, it is important not to lose sight of the fact that even in the sciences and certain esoteric branches of mathematics, for instance, the question, what are they for, is never far from the lips of school and university managers demanding justification for their continued existence in the curriculum. Today, the idea of education as something that is purely a means to an end is becoming more pervasive than ever. Many disciplines are at best conceived of as an adornment to the proper business of the day, something that a few naive academic idealists indulge in, but otherwise are of little value. The idea that, like Socrates, one should dedicate oneself to a discipline rather than a solid career, sometimes termed a proper job, is seen as quaint in others and more than occasionally as proper cause for shame in our nearest and dearest, a position that Callicles would have readily endorsed. Such an attitude has resulted in the development of utilitarian degrees such as business administration, tourism, and education management. Worthy though such courses may be, they are far removed from authentic forms of academic life that boast disciplines with distinguished academic histories. A BSc in accountancy or a PhD in business administration, for example, is accountable to criteria that exist outside the academy, in the sense that their merits are assessed in terms of what can be done with them, how they might improve financial stability or the governance of corporations, for instance. By contrast, degrees in, say, philosophy, fine art, mathematics, physics, or geology need not be answerable to such ends. And although the study of such disciplines frequently yields understanding of a kind that has practical application outside the academy, it is not something that is essential to them, unlike, for example, the kind of utilitarian degrees I just mentioned. In case you think that what I've said in these last remarks is just a matter of intellectual snobbery, let me say that utilitarian subjects are often just as demanding of one's intelligence as disciplines with an academic heritage. Neither is it the case that studying for the sake of one's salary requires more or less intelligence than traditional academic study. It is merely, and I emphasize the merely, it is merely that what matters in each case in terms of how one exercises one's intelligence is very different. Utilitarian degrees are of a kind that Callicles would have endorsed. Those with an academic heritage pursued for no other reason than that one loves them are not. Accordingly, the study of disciplines with an academic heritage for the sake of something that is external to the character of that discipline is not, in essence, an authentic form of study of it, because one's study of such a discipline will be focused and determined by the relevance of it in relation to the criteria that are external to the nature of the discipline itself. But related to all of this is the spirit and ways in which school teachers and academies are expected to teach, and how both teachers and students are expected to conceive of themselves. The language which designates students as customers and their teachers as service providers is common parlance within the media and amongst politicians, and endemic in educational institutions. Such language is not accidental and has found its home within a conception of education that cannot be distinguished from training. A customer is in a position to understand what getting value for money is when they see it, because they are aware of the nature of the products being sold and consequently what they are buying and what they should, as a result, be receiving. One can hold a supermarket to account over the labelling of horse meat as beef, for instance. Similarly, I have a tree felling qualification. In order to acquire my qualification, I undertook training from a qualified training provider. Once I had passed my exam, that was the end of the matter. I had been trained successfully and could be described as a satisfied customer because I had received the product advertised by the course tutor. Similarly, concepts such as learning outcomes and best practice are well known in schools and colleges. Indeed, one might go so far as to say they are beloved of their senior management structures. They are, however, essentially a drive towards mediocrity because they are not resonant with what it can mean to love a discipline and teach it in that spirit. They are merely quantitative concepts that allow us to separate out, in one way or another, achievement from the discipline, usually on some kind of utilitarian foundation that Callicles would revere. However, it is a central feature of authentic study that occasionally neither teacher nor student knows exactly where they are going to end up. That is part of the wonder and beauty of education, and one that is lost if teachers and academics are routinely compelled to provide and follow lists of learning outcomes and forms of best practice in relation to the disciplines they teach. The point is this: in education, students should discover ideas and ways of thinking they had never before considered. These ways of thinking are interdependent with and require the perpetual development and deepening of thought. In training, that is not so. If education is merely treated as a species of training, then the possibility of the wonder and love of the world that an education can nourish will not arise, because one's studies will be answerable to something with a specifiable end. That should be all that is needed to persuade someone of the merits of education, for no other reason than that it is interdependent with the realization of our humanity. Nevertheless, for those who remain unconvinced, it is worth remembering that so many of the technological products that are necessary for the economic welfare of the country are tied up with the kinds of unencumbered thought characterized and expressed in the arts and authentic academic life. We like to watch television dramas, listen to radio, enjoy music through personal audio equipment, and watch films on tablets whilst commuting, for example. And all of these require script writers and so on, artists who don't have proper jobs. As we have seen, a Socratic education can have no such extrinsic constraints, because in the search for truth, exemplified in one's desire to rise to the highest standards one is capable of in one's chosen discipline, one is not always able to say where one will end up. And, Sam said he started off with one particular view and came to embrace another, and that's part of the wonder of it. As such, teaching which is made answerable to strict outcomes which are designed so that students as customers can assess whether they have received the product advertised, not only undermines the pursuit of truth in a discipline, but also degrades the concept of education, and as I've said, to nothing more than a species of training. Teaching that is defined by a love of the discipline one teaches, and through that a desire to reveal to students what it can mean to study it, requires the teacher to transform their students' understanding in a way that illustrates to them what is necessary when attempting to rise to the high standards in a discipline, and what such love looks like in practice. In other words, the student has to learn to love and how to love their discipline, as opposed to understanding their studies as answerable to extrinsic benefits for which that discipline might prove useful. This amounts to embarking upon a journey with the student that must exclude condescension, no matter how benign, whilst being sensitive to the fact that the student is taking their first tentative steps and will be looking to you for guidance. A teacher, whether they be a PhD supervisor or a secondary school teacher, who condescends to their students will be unable to reveal what the love of a discipline can mean and as such unable to illustrate what it takes to try to rise to the highest standards within it, because their condescension is an expression of an inability to see in their students the possibility of worthy companionship on such a journey. So if you recall the remark I made at the beginning about Socrates and conversation, that they try to seek the truth together. I hope to have illustrated, and I appreciate this has been quite dense, but I hope to have illustrated just a few of the lessons about education that one can glean from Plato's work, and why and how his work is as important today as ever. Within this discussion, I have attempted to show the relationship between Plato's suspicion of oratory and the distinction between education and training, and the relationship between these things, forms of study, and ways of teaching. Speaking personally as a teacher, there is nothing more wonderful than witnessing a student having the possibilities of their humanity revealed to them through a love of learning, expressed in a desire for no other reason than to learn. And there is nothing for which I am more grateful than the enduring love of the world I possess, if you like, a kind of absorption in it, bequeathed to me by my parents in the form of a nurtured love of learning, unencumbered by the idea that I should do something with it, which is probably why I'm here. If one believes that bequeathing such a love of the world to one's children is what matters, then how one teaches and the emphasis one places on what is important in learning will be similarly reflected in what one deems to be practical. In both spirit and practice, this Platonic ideal is very different from how one would conduct oneself if, like Callicles or one of his many, many modern counterparts, one believes that what matters is increased prestige and economic welfare. That's it. Does anyone have any questions, or am I going to get away lightly? Gentleman over here. Is that up here? No, right you are.
Okay. Is this on? Yes. I'm interested in the fact that Plato himself recommended only training for the leaders.
Yeah. I wondered who'd spot that tension. Yes, I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, there are 2 points that you could bring out there. Firstly, I mean, I'm not sure that Plato is right about this, okay? I suppose one way that he might answer it, and this is a kind of a long shot, but one way in which he might answer is to say, well, look, in pursuit of knowledge and truth, a guardian doesn't want to rule, right? A guardian has to be persuaded, or a potential guardian has to be persuaded to take up office, right? Often massively against their will, because what they want to do is to continue to search out knowledge and truth. So one of the difficulties Plato has is to say, well, look, in this kind of sense, if we're to educate them in a way that does nothing more than try to get them to love the world and pursue knowledge and understanding for no other reason than that they love it and that's internal to what it is to rise to the sort of potential of their humanity, you have a problem there in terms of, as you say, understanding what training amounts to, because training would say, well, once they become a ruler, then this is the end of what we've been trying to do. You know, we now have our philosopher ruler, and that's it. And provided they do what they do, that's great. But, all right, the famous allegory of the cave, right, where you have the prisoner escaping and moving up the cave out into the world of forms where he can see the distinction between good and bad in everything. He will actually then see that he has to return, Plato makes this point, that he has to return back into the cave to try to drag out the people who have not followed him. He goes to release them. And they often think he's mad, right, and crazy, and they don't understand him. So I think Plato's kind of aware of that problem, because he does say, look, once the philosopher has got out into the world of forms, he will feel compelled to return to try to pull out other people and get them to see the world as he does in terms of knowledge. And so in a sense, yes, they are. Plato does talk about training in the Republic, and I said at the start largely because he has this kind of instrumental idea at heart. He's trying to sort of say this is how a just state should operate, right? And this is what justice is, and the whole of the Republic is dedicated to basically those two things. But at the same time, I think he is aware that were the philosopher not compelled to go back down and try to drag everyone up, then that philosopher would not actually be a philosopher because they would have become complacent. So on the one hand, you've got training for the idea of becoming a ruler, but on the other hand, when that has, in inverted commas, succeeded, when you have your philosopher ruler, that philosopher ruler must nonetheless not rest on his laurels, but must continue to pursue knowledge and truth in ways that are consistent with education as opposed to training. Now, there are kind of, it's tempting to talk about Socrates rather a lot, Plato rather a lot, but one way, one possible reason that there is this confusion in the Republic is because of Plato's commitment to certain kind of metaphysical underpinnings. Right? So the idea that knowledge of any concept such as beauty is ultimately answerable to a whole series of conditions that stand logically independently of anything else, right? And his belief that once we have those, then that is what beauty is, and that is how that is knowledge of beauty. I think that's perhaps why there is this sort of tension, because on the one hand, as I say, he's got this idea of perpetual development of mind, and on the other, you've got this idea that once you've attained full understanding of what beauty is, that's it, you know. So yeah, I mean that's kind of how I'd answer it. It's a fudge, right, in a sense. Right, I'm going to go from the back forward. The lady I think it's red. I can't really see because of the light, and then I'll work forward.
Hello, I'm a bit greedy because I asked a question. I don't know if you were here before when we had the previous talk, but my question is a very similar one, what I'm thinking here, the beauty of your argument is that it's a dynamic picture. In other words, we don't necessarily know with any certainty what the end goal is. We don't have a determined full body of an education. And what we need to create is a dynamic process in which more knowledge can emerge. And it's a very practical thing. In the current contemporary climate, the returns to that kind of broad, general design, scientific research inquiry are absolutely enormous. This has been documented. So we need an education system that permits more of this to happen. And that, I think, also the utilitarian argument is that those utilitarian consequences are unknown in a dynamic future. So what we want to do is create a state in which the most positive outcomes have the greatest likelihood of being achieved.
I mean, the danger with... I'm not arguing, and I hope this didn't come across, but I'm not arguing to say, well, look, we shouldn't ever think about what we do in relation to disciplines with a sort of academic heritage. We shouldn't ever think about what we do purely in terms of our own realization of our own humanity and some such. Of course, right, the study of these subjects and disciplines has a whole host of benefits that are extrinsic to the nature of the disciplines themselves. But the point I was making is that that's part of the wonder of it. If one was only studying those disciplines for the sake of those extrinsic benefits, then that's something else, right? Because then one wouldn't actually be studying those disciplines at all. One would be doing something with, I don't know, a philosophical flavour that was actually answerable to what Google wanted its latest set of graduate employees to do, right? So I think it's as much of a change in spirit as it is in practice that we need to conceive of what we're doing when we educate. And that is something that I think politicians of most shades have failed. Tony Benn was an exception to that, but I mean, these days, the kind of the Corbynist left, right, haven't grasped. It's because it's unimaginative, right? But they could. And maybe the less said about the Conservative Party, the better on that. But, yes, I yeah, absolutely. No, and I wouldn't disagree with that. But in fact, what I think Socrates is arguing or saying is that you try and seek truth together, and a lot of that is a voyage into the unknown. But that doesn't make it. In fact, that makes it more worthwhile than if it were. Yeah. So I mean, okay. I'll leave that because I'll run out of time. So I'll go there and then here. Sorry, the lady in the. I'm going to make you run around now. Yeah, the lady in the white at the back there with her hand up. Yeah, sorry.
Hi, mine's a bit light-hearted, but I was wondering what Plato and Socrates, or both either, would think about the safe spaces now created in educational institutes, such as universities. Safe spaces?
It's interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, in one, the simple answer would be to say that you probably find that Socrates might end up agreeing coincidentally with Callicles on this, because if there is a debate, for example, that is, in inverted commas, shut down because it incites X, Y, or Z, then that, although there may be good reason for doing so in some cases, the fact that the debate itself is then not allowed to take place would be a form of negation of the idea of a conversation. So, for example, were the debate then to be Socrates might say, well, look, we need to reconvene the debate in a way that listens and can converse with one's opposition in ways that are not answerable to just trying to persuade at any cost. So, were someone to say, I don't know, for example, I don't believe women should be allowed to study certain subjects like engineering because they're just not so good and all the rest of it. And you say, what, you really believe that? Right? Explain to me why, and have that conversation, rather than saying, well, look, you're just an ignorant so-and-so, go away. Pull them up and say, look, I want to have a proper conversation with you. I want you to try to explain to me why you believe what you do, and I will do the same to you. And let's see if we don't agree, but let's see where this takes us. Rather than a lot of presuppositions about what is and isn't acceptable. Right? Then that's a Socratic thing again. So. I mean, there's a much more difficult answer that I just don't have time to kind of go into. But, I mean, I think that's perhaps what might be said in relation to it. How long have I got? Am I all right for time? Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, one last question. The chap in the jacket there in the grey shirt. Right.
So I really appreciate the passion of your speech and the plea to democratize the philosophization of education. But another thing that Plato did in the Republic was to divide people up into golds and silvers and brasses and bronze. And I suspect, from my own reading, that he probably would have been appalled at the idea of trying to, for lack of a better word, prostitute philosophy to minds that were more appropriate for merchantry and those sorts of crafts. And so I wonder how that plays into your view of education through a Socratic.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to appeal to. I said at the start I wasn't a Greek scholar, right? But I'm now going to appeal to a matter of scholarship to answer this, because the Republic obviously is one of Plato's middle period works, and the point where you get to the magnificent lie or the noble lie, whatever you want to call it, by that time Plato is understood to be using Socrates as a mouthpiece and asserting hypotheses about what he believes things should be like. Whereas up until the Republic, and there's some debate about this, but some people say that you can actually see the transition from Plato using Socrates' own views in the Republic to when he then just begins to use Socrates as a mouthpiece for his views, as it were. So, up until the Republic, basically, Plato had largely, it is believed, presented the views of his teacher Socrates, perhaps in ways that was largely similar to how Socrates was in the marketplace. Whereas during the Republic itself, he changes and takes Socrates as just a character to be his own to be Plato's mouthpiece. So I would plead inconsistency on that front, and I myself will pin myself to the earlier dialogues and say, look, I think actually what Socrates was about in almost refusing to, well, not almost, he did. He refused to assert theories about things, but rather asked other people through the elenchus, that sort of courtroom-style questioning, to sort of explain why they believed courage was this, or knowledge was that, or virtue was this, you know. So in terms, there is an inconsistency, and I think you're right. I think that in Republic, were we to take Plato's view, he probably would come back at me and say, look, that's horrible, that's, you know, terrible. How can we have shopkeepers learning philosophy, right? Or whatever. But I don't think Socrates would be of the same practice the same kind of thing. I think he would have a conversation with anyone who pitched up in the marketplace and claimed and made a knowledge claim about something, whether they be a farmer, a political ruler, or whatever. If they went to Socrates for a conversation, he would indulge that desire for conversation, and hopefully, in the spirit of seeking truth together, do just that. Whereas, as you point out, the Plato of the Republic perhaps wouldn't. So I'm going to sort of reserve judgment on what Plato might say, but I would pin my flags much more to Socrates in the earlier Platonic dialogues. And with that, I'd better get off because...